Most people think they understand hunger in the Middle Ages. They picture empty bowls, thin bodies, failed harvests, famine sweeping in like a storm. In that version, hunger is an event, something external, bad weather, bad luck, fate. That picture is incomplete. Medieval hunger was rarely sudden. It didn't arrive all at once. It settled in, quietly, and stayed. Most of the time, it wasn't loud enough to record, not dramatic enough to paint, not extreme enough to call starvation. It lived inside daily life, in what passed for normal, which raises an uncomfortable question. What if hunger wasn't a failure of the system, but one of its outcomes? For most medieval Europeans, hunger didn't begin with famine. It began with structure, with who owned land, with who owed whom, with obligations that came before eating. A peasant family could grow food and still be hungry. That sounds like a contradiction. Until you look closer, rent was paid in grain, taxes were taken in grain, church tithes were measured in grain. What was left wasn't abundance. It was leftovers. So hunger wasn't the absence of bread, it was the thinning of it. Smaller loaves, more fillers, longer gaps between meals. Food that came late in the day, after work had already taken its share. People at the time didn't describe hunger the way we do. There are few stories of sharp pain or collapse. Instead, they mention weakness, dizziness, irritability, a sense that the body couldn't quite be trusted. They spoke of lightness, not as something noble, as something persistent. They weren't starving, they were just never full. That distinction matters. Because hunger wasn't an interruption to medieval life. It was medieval life. It shaped how people worked, how they behaved, how they judged one another. Eating well wasn't just enjoyable, it was suspicious. And this is where the familiar story begins to slip. If hunger was constant, then famine wasn't the cause. It was an escalation. A system already stretched too tight, meeting one more strain. The Middle Ages didn't ask whether people had enough to eat. The question was whether they had earned it. That idea didn't appear suddenly. It grew, slowly. And once it settled in, hunger stopped being an emergency and became an expectation. Before we can understand what hunger felt like, we have to understand why it was allowed to feel this way for so long. If hunger was ordinary, then the medieval world had to learn how to live with it. And it did. The tension shows up when you look at effort. Peasants worked constantly. Hard labor, physical, seasonal, little rest, almost no recovery. Yet the food needed to support that work was rarely enough. To us, that looks like failure. To them, it looked like discipline. Food wasn't given based on need. It was given based on entitlement. That entitlement was legal before it was moral. The land belonged to someone else. Access came with conditions. People didn't go hungry because food didn't exist. They went hungry because obligations were fixed and harvests were not. Rent didn't change when bodies were tired. Tithes didn't shrink when appetites grew. The system assumed the body would adapt, and mostly, it did. This is one of the quieter truths of medieval hunger. People adjusted downward, not bravely, not consciously, slowly. Bodies grew smaller. Expectations narrowed. Hunger stopped, meaning something was wrong, and started meaning things were working. Records tell us a lot about grain, where it moved, who received it. They say almost nothing about eating. Consumption didn't matter. Transfer did. Eating was private, and what's private is rarely protected. Even language reflected this. Meals weren't defined by fullness. They were defined by timing. 1 meal a day was normal. 2 meant comfort. 3 suggested excess or sickness. Eating early raised suspicion. Eating often suggested weak discipline. The church reinforced this pattern, not out of cruelty, out of order. Fasting days were many. They overlapped. They were unavoidable. On paper, they guided the spirit. In practice, they limited protein. Meat disappeared. So did dairy. So did eggs. Fish was meant to replace them, but fish didn't travel evenly inland. The rule assumed substitution. Life offered dilution. What emerges isn't cruelty. It's alignment. Religion, economics, agriculture, all pointing the same way. Restraint was praised. Endurance was normal. Hunger became proof of seriousness. And here's the quiet irony. The people who produced food were the least free to eat it, not because anyone declared it so, but because nothing existed to question it. Hunger didn't feel like panic. It felt like postponement, like something that would be handled later, after the work, after the dues, after the calendar allowed it. Later, though, was often theoretical. That's why medieval hunger is hard to see now. It left few dramatic scenes and many lingering sensations. The system didn't break. It worked, just not for the people inside it. To understand how this lasted for centuries, we have to step backward, not to famine, but to the logic that made famine survivable for some and routine for others. That logic didn't start in the fields. To understand why hunger could last without constant revolt, we have to leave the fields and step into the ideas behind them. Medieval society inherited a hierarchy that treated inequality as stabilizing. Order mattered more than comfort. Predictability mattered more than enough. A system that fed everyone equally wouldn't have looked kind. It would have looked dangerous. This thinking ran deep. Classical philosophy, reshaped by Christian theology, divided the world into fixed roles. Each role had duties, not promises. Fulfillment wasn't measured by feeling satisfied, it was measured by obedience. A peasant wasn't meant to thrive, he was meant to endure. Hunger fit cleanly into this logic. It wasn't proof of injustice, it was proof of place. The law reinforced this quietly. Access was not ownership. Common lands existed, but their use was controlled. Forests held food, game, berries, firewood. Yet taking it was often illegal. Poaching wasn't framed as desperation. It was trespass. Hunger didn't excuse it. It confirmed the boundary. This is where the system shows its efficiency. By cutting off informal access to food, it forced reliance on formal paths, markets, rents, wages. Those paths could be watched, counted, taxed. Hunger wasn't a breakdown, it was leverage. Even charity had limits. Alms were public, measured, temporary. They eased suffering without removing it. Too much comfort blurred lines, and blurred lines threatened order. The poor could be helped, but not secured. Security meant independence. No one asked whether constant hunger reduced productivity. The assumption ran the other way. A body that needed to eat tomorrow would work today. Mild hunger wasn't disabling. It was motivating. From the outside, this can look cruel. That's misleading. The system was consistent. People believed they were preventing chaos. Hunger was unfortunate, but it was familiar. And familiarity dulls alarm. The most unsettling part is this. Hunger didn't feel like crisis because it was predictable. It came on schedule. Late winter, early spring, before the first harvest. People prepared for it, the way they prepared for cold. There was even a name for it, the hungry gap, not a failure, a phase. Once hunger is seasonal, it becomes manageable. Once it's manageable, it becomes invisible. And once it's invisible, it stops asking for justification. What went unexamined was what this constant deficit was doing to bodies, to judgment, to endurance. Not over days, over decades. That damage wouldn't announce itself. It would build. By the time hunger becomes seasonal, the system no longer absorbs shocks. People do. Medieval society managed food instability by pushing uncertainty downward into the body. Harvests failed. Rents stayed fixed. Weather turned. Obligations didn't. The body was expected to close the gap, and it did, quietly. Chronic hunger changes feeling before it changes form. It stops arriving as sharp pain. It becomes dull, persistent, negotiable. People learned what could be done lightheaded and what couldn't. Which days required food first, which could wait. Appetite became tactical. Children grew up inside this pattern. Shorter bodies were normal, no comment required. Illness was expected. Recovery was slow. A body that healed quickly suggested rest or privilege. This is where medieval hunger resists modern language. It wasn't emergency pain. It was reduced capacity, strength that never fully came, focus that drifted, endurance that existed, but charged interest later. Work didn't stop. It couldn't. So labor adjusted. Tasks broke into smaller pieces. Tools compensated for fatigue. Animals carried more where they could. The goal wasn't health. It was survival until tomorrow. Medicine didn't challenge this. Humoral theory framed hunger as imbalance, not shortage. Weakness came from within, not from lack. Treatment meant correction, not provision. That distinction mattered. Hunger became personal, not structural. Early death meant poor constitution. Failed pregnancies meant fate. Falling output meant moral failure. The system stayed innocent because no language existed to accuse it. The shift didn't come from sympathy. It came from accumulation. Population grew. Land fractured. The body's margin shrank. Bad years stacked. The hungry gap widened. What had been seasonal became constant. And hunger changed. Not suddenly, gradually. It began to interfere with birth, with labor, with stability. Authorities responded logically. They fixed prices, controlled markets, restricted movement. But the core assumption stayed, that bodies could keep absorbing strain. Eventually, they couldn't, not because people weakened, but because nothing remained to adjust. What followed is usually called catastrophe. A better word might be exposure. When the buffer failed, hunger finally became visible. This is where history usually starts paying attention. Crop failures, price spikes, unrest, death. The moments when hunger crossed a line and entered the records. These are what we call famine. But by the time famine arrived, hunger was already old. It didn't feel sudden. It felt like a rule tightened one last turn. Meals weren't removed. They were reduced past usefulness. Work didn't stop. It asked more from bodies with nothing left. Later accounts are revealing. People don't describe constant pain. They describe heaviness, confusion, thought narrowing. Choices grew harder. Time felt strange. The future lost detail. Hunger didn't scream. It simplified. This is what's often missed. Medieval hunger wasn't mainly a stomach sensation. It was a condition, shaped over years. Someone who had always eaten enough experienced starvation as shock. Someone who never had experienced it as continuation. Looking back, it feels inevitable. A system built on mild deprivation has no language for severe deprivation. When it arrives, there are only familiar tools: exhortation, restraint, prayer, punishment. None of them produce food. The pattern repeats across centuries, not in details, in logic. When access is conditional, when bodies absorb instability, when hunger is framed as failure or test. It works, until it doesn't. What remains from the Middle Ages isn't just malnutrition or death. It's a misunderstanding of hunger itself, as an event, a crisis, something external. For most medieval people, hunger wasn't rare enough to escape or dramatic enough to revolt against. It was background, like cold stone, worn tools, a calendar that always asked more than it returned. They didn't ask when hunger would end. They asked when it would ease. Sometimes it did. Then the cycle returned. Seen this way, medieval hunger doesn't feel foreign. It feels organized, predictable, rational, designed not by cruelty, but by systems that confused endurance with sustainability. Once those systems existed, hunger didn't need enforcement. It simply happened.